Chapter 1. The Find at Portobello Market. Marcus Webb's hands were shaking again, not from the cold November rain that had soaked through his coat, but from the dream, the same dream that had haunted him for 3 years. His father's study, the open drawer, the note that read, "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." And then his father's body, slumped over his desk in that same study, the coroner's verdict, natural causes, heart attack, case closed. But Marcus knew better. His father had been murdered. He just couldn't prove it. At 47, Marcus had inherited Webb & Sons Antiques in Kensington, along with his father's obsession. The old man had spent his final years hunting for Victorian artifacts connected to unsolved crimes, convinced that objects carried truth when words failed. "History hides in plain sight, son," he'd say, turning a pocket watch over in his weathered hands. "You just have to know where to look." Now Marcus walked through Portobello Market every Saturday searching. For what, he couldn't say. A sign. Evidence. Something his father had been close to finding before someone silenced him. "Marcus!" Mrs. Chen's voice cut through the crowd. She was waving frantically from her stall, her face flushed with excitement. "You need to see this, now!" Something in her tone made his pulse quicken. Mrs. Chen had been feeding him Victorian pieces for 5 years, but she'd never looked at him like this, like she was holding something dangerous. She pulled him behind her stall, glancing over her shoulder. House clearance in Mayfair. Old family, very private. They didn't want anyone asking questions. She opened a deteriorating velvet box. Inside lay a gold locket, the kind that wealthy Victorians commissioned for significant occasions. Or secrets. Marcus lifted it carefully. The weight hit him immediately, far too heavy for its size. His breath caught. The engraving was masterwork. Intertwining vines and roses, each petal detailed with obsessive precision. On the front, barely visible, the initials, M.W. "How much?" £80, but Marcus... Mrs. Chen lowered her voice. "The family wanted it destroyed. Said it was cursed. I only saved it because I know you collect these things." Cursed. The word hung in the damp air. Marcus paid without negotiation and nearly ran back to his shop. Inside, he locked the door and went straight to his workbench. His hands trembled as he placed the locket under the lamp. The digital scale read 47.3 grams. Impossible. A locket this size should weigh 35 grams maximum. Something was hidden inside. He tested the clasp. It opened, revealing empty chambers on both sides. No photograph, no hair, nothing. But the weight didn't lie. Marcus grabbed his jeweler's loupe, examining every millimeter. That's when he saw it, microscopic scratching along the interior rim, so fine it looked like wear marks. But under magnification, they formed words. "Forgive me, Lord, for what I have done." His heart hammered against his ribs. This was a confession. Someone had hidden a confession inside expensive jewelry, then sealed it away. He measured the interior depth against the exterior thickness. 5 millimeters missing on each side. False compartments. His father had told him about these. Victorian aristocrats used them to hide poison tablets, incriminating letters, evidence of crimes that polite society would never acknowledge. Marcus pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called David Chen, the only jeweler in London skilled enough to open Victorian false compartments without destroying them. "I need you, now, it's urgent." "Marcus, it's Saturday evening. Please, David, this could be what my father was looking for." A long pause. David had known his father, had attended the funeral, had never believed the heart attack story either. "Bring it to Hatton Garden. I'll be waiting." 40 minutes later, Marcus stood in David's studio, watching the 62-year-old master jeweler examine the locket under a digital microscope connected to a large monitor. The magnified image revealed engineering that shouldn't exist, hinges thinner than human hair, seams invisible to the naked eye. "Broadhurst work," David murmured. 1886, maybe 1887. This level of craftsmanship. He looked up, his eyes serious. "Someone paid a fortune to hide something, Marcus. Are you sure you want to know what's inside?" Marcus thought of his father, the open drawer, the note. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. "Open it." David worked in concentrated silence, using dental probes to test microscopic pressure points. 25 minutes passed. Then, click. A section of the interior pivoted upward, revealing a thin compartment. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Marcus's hands shook as David extracted it with tweezers and carefully began unfolding it on a white surface. The paper was surprisingly intact, covered in elegant Victorian script. "Should I read it?" David asked quietly. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. David positioned the paper under the light and began reading aloud. To whoever finds this confession, may God grant you wisdom in its use. My name is Margaret Wilson, and by the time you read these words, I will likely have faced the judgment I deserve. I write this on the 3rd of November, 1887, with a clear mind and a condemned soul. Marcus leaned closer, his pulse roaring in his ears. I have murdered my husband, Charles Wilson, merchant of fine textiles, respected member of London society. I administered arsenic, purchased as rat poison from the chemist on Bond Street, mixed into his evening brandy over the course of 3 weeks. The physicians declared his death natural, a failure of the heart. They were wrong. David stopped reading, looking at Marcus with wide eyes. This is a murder confession. Keep going, Marcus whispered. But before you condemn me as a monster, know this. Charles was not the man society believed him to be. In our home, behind locked doors, he was a different creature entirely. The bruises I covered with powder and long sleeves. The broken ribs I explained away as a fall downstairs. The miscarriages, 3 of them, that no doctor could prevent because no doctor knew their true cause. Marcus felt his throat tighten. I killed him because the law would not protect me, because divorce would leave me penniless and ruined, because when I went to the police, they laughed and told me to be a more obedient wife. So I became judge, jury, and executioner, and I am not sorry. The confession continued for another paragraph, detailing how Margaret had hidden the locket with a trusted servant before her own death, requesting it be sold after 50 years had passed. She'd hoped that someday someone would find it and understand. If you are reading this, then I have succeeded in speaking from beyond the grave. I do not ask for forgiveness. I am beyond that mercy. I ask only that you remember. Sometimes murder is not the greatest crime. Sometimes survival is. The confession ended with her initials. M.W. Marcus stood in stunned silence, staring at words written 138 years ago by a woman who had been driven to kill the man who was supposed to love her. A woman the law refused to help. A woman who had turned a piece of expensive jewelry into evidence of her own crime and her husband's. What are you going to do with this? David asked softly. Marcus thought of his father again, his obsession with Victorian crimes, his belief that truth mattered, even centuries later. And suddenly Marcus understood. This locket might not be connected to his father's death, but it represented everything his father had fought for, giving voice to the silenced, revealing what polite society preferred to bury. I'm going to find out everything about Margaret Wilson, Marcus said, his voice steady for the first time in 3 years. Her life, her death, what happened after she killed her husband. And then I'm going to tell her story. David nodded slowly. Your father would be proud. Marcus carefully photographed every word of the confession, then examined the locket again. There was still a second false compartment. David had only opened one side. What's in the other side? Marcus asked. David adjusted his tools and began working on the second compartment. Another 15 minutes of careful probing. Another quiet click. This time, the hidden space revealed something different. A small lock of dark hair tied with thread, and beneath it, a tiny photograph. A carte de visite showing a young woman with haunted eyes and a man standing beside her, his hand gripping her shoulder so tightly his knuckles were white. On the back, in the same handwriting as the confession, Charles and Margaret Wilson, wedding portrait, June 1879. Remember what smiles can hide. Marcus stared at Margaret's face in the photograph. She was smiling for the camera, as Victorian brides were supposed to, but her eyes told a different story, a story of fear, desperation, and something else Marcus recognized from his own mirror in the months after his father's death. Rage. This is just the beginning, Marcus whispered, more to himself than to David. Margaret Wilson wanted someone to know the truth, and now someone does. He gathered the locket, the confession, and the photograph carefully, wrapping them in soft cloth. Outside David's studio, London's night had fully descended, rain beginning to fall again. But Marcus barely noticed. For the first time in 3 years, he had purpose. Not just grief and suspicion, but something tangible. A mystery he could actually solve. A woman's voice that deserved to be heard. Margaret Wilson had reached across 138 years to tell her story, and Marcus Webb was going to make sure the world listened. But as he walked back to the underground, clutching the leather case containing the locket, Marcus couldn't shake one disturbing thought. Mrs. Chen had said the family wanted the locket destroyed, that they'd called it cursed. which meant Margaret Wilson's descendants knew what was inside, and they'd spent over a century trying to keep it buried. Chapter 2. The Search for Margaret Wilson. Marcus Webb didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table until dawn, the locket open before him. Margaret Wilson's confession and photograph spread across the oak surface like evidence at a crime scene, which, he supposed, they were. At 6 a.m., he was already dressed and heading to the London Metropolitan Archives, a massive repository of historical records housed in a brutalist concrete building in Clerkenwell. If Margaret Wilson had lived, married, killed, and died in London during the 1880s, there would be records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, property transfers, court documents. The Victorians documented everything, obsessed with order and bureaucracy, even as they concealed their darkest secrets behind parlor doors. The archives didn't open until 9:30, so Marcus grabbed coffee from a nearby cafe and watched the early morning crowds rushing to work. London looked the same as it had yesterday, but felt fundamentally different. Somewhere beneath these modern streets lay the bones of Margaret Wilson's world. The London of 1887, with its gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages, its rigid social hierarchies, and its women trapped in marriages that law and custom made inescapable. His phone buzzed. David Chen. Did you sleep? David's voice sounded concerned. No. Did you? About 3 hours. Marcus, I've been thinking about that locket. If the family wanted it destroyed, they might not appreciate you digging into their history. Marcus took a long sip of coffee. Margaret wanted someone to find this? She planned for someone to find it? I owe it to her to tell the truth. A pause. Just be careful. Victorian families went to extraordinary lengths to protect their reputations. That doesn't change just because a century's passed. By 9:35, Marcus was seated at a research terminal with 3 massive, leather-bound volumes. Marriage records for London, 1870, 1890. He started with June 1879, the date on Margaret's wedding portrait. The handwriting was archaic, the ink faded, but Marcus had become expert at deciphering Victorian script over the years. Page after page of names. James and Charlotte, Edward and Anne, William and Sarah. And then, on June 28, 1879, Charles Edmund Wilson, merchant of textiles, age 31, married Margaret Alice Hartwell, age 19, at St. Mary's Church, Islington. Marcus's hands trembled as he photographed the entry. Margaret Hartwell had become Margaret Wilson at 19, marrying a man 12 years her senior. The age gap wasn't unusual for Victorian society. Wealthy, older men frequently married younger women from respectable but less affluent families. But knowing what Marcus knew about how that marriage had ended made the record feel ominous. He moved to death records, starting with 1887, the year Margaret had written her confession. His pulse quickened when he found it. Wilson, Charles Edmund, died. August 17th, 1887, age 39. Cause of death, cardiac failure. Residence, 47 Belgrave Square, London. Belgrave Square, one of London's most prestigious addresses, home to aristocracy and the exceptionally wealthy. Charles Wilson hadn't just been a merchant, he'd been rich. The kind of wealth that bought power, influence, and the ability to make uncomfortable questions disappear. Marcus's stomach tightened. If Margaret had been living at 47 Belgrave Square when she poisoned her husband, she'd done it surrounded by servants, neighbors, and the watchful eyes of London's upper class. The fact that no one had suspected murder spoke to either Margaret's careful planning or the absolute unwillingness of Victorian society to believe a respectable woman capable of such violence. He continued searching and found Margaret's death record 2 years later. Wilson, Margaret Alice, died June 3rd, 1889, age 29. Cause of death, consumption. Residence, 47 Belgrave Square, London. Consumption, tuberculosis. The Victorian killer that claimed thousands, particularly women. But Margaret's confession said she expected to face the judgment I deserve. Had guilt destroyed her, or had something else killed Margaret Wilson within 2 years of murdering her husband? Marcus needed more information. He requested newspaper archives from the Times, specifically issues from August 1887. If a wealthy merchant had died suddenly in Belgrave Square, there would have been obituaries, possibly even news coverage. The microfiche reader flickered to life, displaying yellowed pages from August 19th, 1887. Marcus scrolled through society notices, advertisements for patent medicines, and parliamentary debates. Then he found it. Death of prominent London merchant. It is with deep regret we report the sudden passing of Mr. Charles Edmund Wilson, respected textile merchant and member of the London Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Wilson, age 39, died at his residence in Belgrave Square on the 17th instant. After a brief illness, physicians attending him report cardiac failure as the cause of death. Mr. Wilson was known throughout London's business community for his successful import operations and his patronage of various charitable organizations. He is survived by his wife, Mrs. Margaret Wilson, and leaves behind an estate valued at approximately $150,000. Marcus did the mental calculation. $150,000 in 1887 was equivalent to roughly $18 million today. Margaret hadn't just murdered her husband. She'd inherited an absolute fortune. The obituary continued with glowing praise for Charles Wilson's business acumen and community involvement. There wasn't a hint of scandal, not a whisper of suspicion. Margaret had gotten away with it completely. But Marcus knew the truth, and he needed to know why Margaret had felt compelled to confess, to hide evidence of her crime in an expensive locket and hope that someday someone would find it and understand. He searched for more articles about the Wilson family through 1887 and 1888. Society pages mentioned Mrs. Margaret Wilson attending charity functions, hosting soirees, and contributing generously to various causes. She appeared to be living the life of a wealthy young widow, accepted completely by London society. Then, in March 1889, 3 months before her death, Marcus found something that made his blood run cold. Concern for Mrs. Wilson's health. Friends of Mrs. Margaret Wilson express worry over her declining health. The young widow, who has been a prominent figure in London charitable circles since the death of her husband in 1887, has become increasingly frail in recent months. Dr. Harrison Whitmore, her attending physician, reports that Mrs. Wilson suffers from consumption and that her condition has deteriorated rapidly, despite the best medical care available. Marcus stared at the screen. Rapidly, despite the best medical care available. The phrasing felt wrong. Tuberculosis could kill quickly, but there was something about the way the article was written that suggested surprise at the speed of Margaret's decline. He searched for Dr. Harrison Whitmore in medical directories from the 1880s and found him listed as a physician to elite London families, specializing in diseases of women. Something clicked in Marcus's mind. Victorian physicians who specialized in diseases of women often treated conditions that were actually the result of domestic violence. Broken bones attributed to falls, internal injuries explained as hysteria, and mysterious ailments that conveniently kept women confined to their homes and under male control. Had Dr. Whitmore been Charles Wilson's physician as well? Had he known something about Margaret's situation? Marcus needed to find out more about the doctor. The archives had professional medical journals from the era, including the London Medical Gazette. Marcus requested issues from 1887-1889 and began the tedious process of searching through advertisements and articles. His persistence paid off. In an 1888 issue, he found a letter to the editor from Dr. Harrison Whitmore. In response to the recent discussion of arsenic poisoning symptoms, I feel compelled to share my professional observations. Having attended several cases where arsenic exposure was suspected, I can attest that the symptoms are often mistaken for natural ailments, cardiac distress, gastric upset, and general decline of health. It is my professional opinion that our medical community must become more vigilant in identifying potential cases of deliberate poisoning, particularly in domestic situations where access to arsenic-based compounds is common. The letter was dated March 1888, 6 months after Charles Wilson's death. Marcus felt his heart pounding. Dr. Whitmore had suspected something. The letter was carefully worded. He wasn't accusing anyone specifically, but the timing was too coincidental. He'd treated Charles Wilson during his final illness, signed the death certificate stating cardiac failure, and then months later written this letter about arsenic poisoning symptoms being mistaken for natural causes. Had Dr. Whitmore known Margaret had murdered her husband? Or had he only suspected after the fact and felt guilty for missing the signs? Marcus needed to find out more about Margaret's final months. He returned to newspaper archives, searching for any mention of her between March and June 1889. He found scattered society page mentions, Margaret hosting a garden party in April, Margaret attending the opera in May. But the tone of the reporting changed over those months. Early mentions described her as gracious and elegant. Later ones used words like pale, withdrawn, and suffering bravely. Then Marcus found Margaret's obituary from June 5, 1889, death of Mrs. Margaret Wilson. Mrs. Margaret Alice Wilson, beloved widow of the late Charles Edmund Wilson, passed away at her Belgrave Square residence on the 3rd inst. After a prolonged struggle with consumption. Mrs. Wilson, who was only 29 years of age, had become known throughout London for her charitable works and gentle disposition. Despite her youth and wealth, she faced her illness with remarkable courage and Christian faith. Dr. Harrison Whitmore, who attended her throughout her final months, stated that Mrs. Wilson's decline was one of the most heartbreaking cases of his career, as no treatment seemed to halt the disease's progression. She will be interred at Highgate Cemetery beside her late husband. Mrs. Wilson leaves behind no direct heirs, with her considerable estate passing to various charitable organizations as specified in her will. No direct heirs. Margaret had died without children. She'd been married for 8 years, but had no surviving offspring. Marcus thought about the confession, the miscarriages Margaret had mentioned, 3 of them caused by her husband's violence, and there was that phrase again. No treatment seemed to halt the disease's progression, almost as if Dr. Whitmore was defending himself against unspoken criticism. Marcus's phone buzzed again. A text from David. "Have you found anything?" Marcus typed back. "Too much. Need to visit Highgate Cemetery." Highgate Cemetery sprawled across 37 acres of North London, a Victorian necropolis that had opened in 1839 and quickly became the final resting place for London's elite. By the time Marcus arrived that afternoon, storm clouds were gathering overhead, casting the cemetery in gray, oppressive light. The cemetery office held records of every burial. The clerk, a woman in her 60s named Eleanor, helped Marcus locate Margaret Wilson's grave. "West Side, Section 14, Eleanor said, tracing her finger across a map. "It's a double plot. Mr. Wilson was buried there first in 1887, and Mrs. Wilson was laid beside him in 1889. She looked up at Marcus curiously. "Are you family?" "Researcher," Marcus said. "I'm investigating the family's history." Eleanor nodded. "The Wilson plot is one of our better-maintained graves. Someone's been paying for upkeep for over a century. Very unusual." Marcus's pulse quickened. "Do you know who's paying?" "Would be in the records." Eleanor pulled out a ledger. "Yes, here. The Wilson Family Trust, established 1889, managed by..." She squinted at the notation. "Whitmore and Associates, Solicitors." Whitmore, the same name as Margaret's physician. It couldn't be coincidence. Marcus found the grave 20 minutes later, after navigating overgrown paths and Gothic monuments. The Wilson plot was exactly as Eleanor had described, impeccably maintained, the marble headstone clean, and the surrounding area free of weeds. The inscription read, "Charles Edmund Wilson, 1848-1887, beloved husband, respected merchant, Margaret Alice Wilson, 1860-1889, devoted wife, charitable soul, together in death as in life." Marcus felt rage building in his chest. Together in death as in life. A complete lie. Margaret hadn't been devoted. She'd been desperate, and being buried beside the man who'd brutalized her felt like a final indignity. But as he stood there, staring at the grave, something else occurred to him. Dr. Whitmore had established a trust to maintain the grave. Why would Margaret's physician create a permanent trust to care for the burial plot of a patient? Unless he felt guilty. Unless he knew something he couldn't say publicly but wanted to honor Margaret's memory privately. Marcus pulled out his phone and searched for Whitmore and Associates, Solicitors, London. The firm still existed, now called Whitmore, Blackwell and Partners, with offices in Bloomsbury. He called immediately. "Whitmore, Blackwell and Partners. How may I direct your call?" "I'm researching a Victorian-era trust established by Dr. Harrison Whitmore in 1889, the Wilson Family Trust. I'd like to speak with someone about accessing historical records." A pause. "One moment, please." Marcus was transferred 3 times before finally reaching a senior partner named Richard Blackwell. "Mr. Webb, you're asking about a very old trust. May I ask why?" Blackwell's voice was cautious. "I'm an antiques dealer. I've come into possession of an item that belonged to Margaret Wilson, and I'm trying to understand its historical context." "What kind of item?" Marcus hesitated. "A personal item, with significant historical value." Another pause. "Mr. Webb, the Wilson Family Trust includes specific instructions regarding any items that might surface connected to Mrs. Wilson. I think you should come to our office. Are you available tomorrow morning?" Marcus's heart raced. "What kind of instructions?" "The kind we should discuss in person. Shall we say 10 a.m.? Marcus barely slept that night, his mind racing with possibilities. What instructions had Dr. Whitmore left regarding Margaret's possessions? Did he know about the locket? About the confession? At 9:45 a.m., Marcus stood outside Whitmore, Blackwell and Partners, a respectable Georgian building near the British Museum. His hands were sweating despite the cool morning air. Richard Blackwell was in his 50s, with silver hair and the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades handling other people's secrets. He ushered Marcus into a private conference room and closed the door. "Before we proceed, Mr. Webb, I need to see what you've found." Marcus carefully unwrapped the locket and placed it on the conference table, along with photographs of the confession and the wedding portrait. Blackwell's face went pale as he read Margaret's words. His hands shook slightly as he set down the photographs. "My God," he whispered, "after all these years." "You knew?" Marcus asked. Blackwell nodded slowly. "Not specifically, but Dr. Whitmore left extensive private papers with this firm when he died in 1923. They've been sealed, with instructions that they should only be opened if certain specific items connected to Margaret Wilson ever surfaced. A gold locket was on that list." Marcus's heart pounded. "Can I see those papers?" Blackwell studied Marcus for a long moment. Dr. Whitmore wrote in his instructions that if the locket was ever found, the person who found it was to be given access to his private testimony. He wanted the truth known, but only when it could no longer harm Mrs. Wilson's reputation or implicate living individuals. "Everyone involved has been dead for over a century," Marcus said quietly. "Exactly." Blackwell stood. "Wait here." He returned 15 minutes later, carrying a sealed leather document box, its brass lock tarnished with age. Blackwell produced an old-fashioned key and opened it. Inside was a thick sheaf of papers covered in precise handwriting. The first page read, "Private testimony of Dr. Harrison Whitmore regarding the death of Charles Edmund Wilson and Margaret Alice Wilson, written October 1889, to be opened only upon discovery of specified evidence." Marcus began reading, and Dr. Whitmore's testimony confirmed his worst suspicions and revealed something even more horrifying than he'd imagined. "I write this testimony 4 months after Mrs. Margaret Wilson's death, compelled by conscience to record the truth, even though I cannot make it public without destroying what remains of her reputation. I was Charles Wilson's physician from 1880 until his death in 1887, and I became Margaret's physician upon their marriage in 1879. Over those 8 years, I witnessed things that haunt me still. Charles Wilson was a monster who concealed his nature behind wealth and social position. I treated Margaret for accidents 17 times during her marriage, broken bones, severe bruising, internal injuries. Each time she gave the expected excuses, falls, clumsiness, unfortunate incidents. Each time I wrote the expected diagnosis and said nothing. I am complicit in her suffering through my silence." Marcus felt sick as he continued reading. "In August 1887, I was summoned to the Wilson residence. Charles was gravely ill, vomiting, abdominal pain, weakness, cardiac distress. I recognized the symptoms as consistent with arsenic poisoning, but I said nothing. I watched Margaret tend to her dying husband with perfect devotion while his body destroyed itself from within. When he died, I signed the death certificate listing cardiac failure. It was not a lie. The arsenic had caused his heart to fail. But it was not the whole truth. Margaret never confessed to me directly, but during a medical examination 6 months after Charles's death, she asked me a curious question. Dr. Whitmore, do you believe there are circumstances where taking a life is not murder, but self-defense? I told her that morally, yes, I believed there were such circumstances. She wept then, the only time I ever saw her cry. She said nothing more, but I understood. What haunts me most is what came after. Margaret lived for 2 years as a wealthy widow, generous with her fortune, beloved by London society. But I watched her deteriorate before my eyes. Not from consumption, though that was my diagnosis. She was being poisoned, slowly, methodically, with the same arsenic she had used on her husband. Marcus's hands shook so badly he had to set the papers down. "Someone murdered her," he whispered. Blackwell nodded grimly. "Keep reading." I could not prove it, but I knew. Someone in that household was killing Margaret Wilson. I suspected Charles's brother, Edmund, who had expected to inherit Charles's fortune, and was furious when it went to Margaret instead. But without proof, without Margaret's cooperation, I could do nothing. When I tried to discuss my suspicions with her, she refused to hear them. "I deserve this," she told me. "This is my judgment." She believed her own murder was divine punishment for killing her husband. I tried to save her. Different treatments, removing suspected items from her diet, suggesting she travel away from London. Nothing worked because Margaret had accepted her fate. She was allowing herself to be murdered as penance for her own crime. By the time I realized the full truth, it was too late. She died on June 3rd, 1889, and I signed another death certificate, this time listing consumption and once again failing to record the truth. I established a trust to maintain her grave and created this testimony in the hope that someday, somehow, the full story would emerge. Margaret Wilson was a victim who became a murderer out of desperation and then became a victim again through her own guilt. She deserves to be remembered not as a monster or a saint, but as a human being trapped in circumstances that destroyed her. The testimony ended with a list of evidence Dr. Whitmore had preserved: medical records, samples of Margaret's hair showing arsenic levels increasing from 1887-1889, and copies of Edmund Wilson's financial records showing desperate debts that would have been resolved by his brother's inheritance. Marcus looked up at Blackwell, his eyes burning. "This is all true?" "Dr. Whitmore had no reason to lie in a sealed document," Blackwell said quietly. "And the evidence he preserved has been tested with modern forensic methods. The hair samples confirm chronic arsenic exposure. Margaret Wilson was definitely being poisoned during the 2 years between her husband's death and her own." Marcus thought of Margaret's confession hidden in the locket, her belief that she deserved punishment, her acceptance of her own murder as divine justice. The tragedy of it overwhelmed him. "What happened to Edmund Wilson?" Marcus asked. "Died in 1904, quite wealthy, despite supposedly being in debt. He married shortly after Margaret's death and lived comfortably for 15 years. Whatever he did, he got away with it completely." Marcus carefully gathered the locket and the papers. "I'm going to tell her story, the full story. Margaret deserves that much." Blackwell nodded. "Dr. Whitmore would have wanted that. He left instructions that if the truth ever came out, this firm would assist in any way necessary. We'll provide you with copies of everything: the testimony, the evidence, the medical records. Make sure Margaret Wilson is remembered correctly." As Marcus left the law office, carrying 136 years of buried truth, he thought about Margaret Wilson, a 19-year-old bride who'd become a victim, then a killer, then a victim again. A woman who'd hidden her confession in gold, hoping someone would eventually understand that her crime had been an act of survival. And now someone did. Now everyone would. But as Marcus walked through Bloomsbury's busy streets, one question gnawed at him. Mrs. Chen had said the family wanted the locket destroyed. The Wilson line should have ended with Margaret. So who, after more than a century, was still trying to keep the secret buried? His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You should stop digging into the Wilson family. Some graves are meant to stay closed." Marcus stopped walking, his blood running cold. Someone knew what he'd found. Someone was watching, and suddenly the mystery of Margaret Wilson's locket had become something more than historical tragedy. It had become dangerous. Chapter 3. The Watcher in the Shadows. Marcus Webb stared at the threatening text message on his phone, his thumb hovering over the reply button. Then he thought better of it. Whoever had sent this wanted a response, wanted to know they'd frightened him. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, he took a screenshot, forwarded it to David Chen with a brief message. "Keep this safe. If anything happens to me, take it to the police," and deleted the unknown number from his phone. His hands were steadier than he expected. 3 years of believing his father had been murdered had prepared him for this moment. Back in his Kensington shop, Marcus locked the door and pulled the security shutters down early, ignoring the curious looks from passers-by. He carried the locket, Dr. Whitmore's testimony, and all the documents from Blackwell's office to his safe, then hesitated. If someone knew he had the locket, they might know about his shop's safe. It was the obvious place to look. He needed somewhere unexpected, somewhere connected to his father. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood in the cramped storage unit he'd rented after his father's death, filled with boxes of unsold inventory and personal effects he hadn't been able to bring himself to sort through. Hidden among Victorian pocket watches and antique jewelry was a small, fireproof box his father had kept in his office. Marcus had never opened it, unable to face whatever final secrets his father might have left behind. Tonight, that changed. He unlocked the box with the key he'd carried for 3 years. Inside were papers, photographs, and a leather journal filled with his father's cramped handwriting. Marcus's throat tightened as he recognized the same obsessive note-taking style he'd inherited. Dates, names, connections drawn between seemingly unrelated Victorian crimes. But one entry made Marcus's blood run cold. October 2022. received anonymous tip about the Wilson family. Caller claimed descendants still living in London, still protecting family secrets, investigating connection between Charles Wilson's textile business and illegal opium importation from China, 1880s. Wilson may have been involved in criminal enterprise far beyond what's publicly known. Marcus flipped through the pages frantically. His father had been investigating the Wilson family 2 weeks before his death. The entries became more agitated, the handwriting more erratic. October 12th. Cannot find official records of Wilson's business after 1887. Shipping manifests missing from archives. Someone has removed evidence. October 18th. Followed to shop today. Black Mercedes, no plates visible. Am I being paranoid, or is someone watching? October 21st. Misses. Chen at Portobello contacted me about Locket coming up in estate sale. Says family desperate to destroy it. Offering $500 to ensure it's never sold. I've told her to refuse and contact me immediately if it surfaces. The final entry was dated October 23, 2022, the day before his father died. Meeting anonymous source tonight who claims to have information about Margaret Wilson's death. They insist Edmund Wilson didn't act alone. Wilson family had connections to organized crime networks. Margaret knew too much. If something happens to me, the answers are in... The entry ended mid-sentence. Marcus's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the journal. His father had been murdered. He'd been investigating the same family, the same secrets, the same locket that Marcus now possessed. And whoever had killed his father was still out there, still protecting the Wilson family's reputation, still sending threatening text messages. Marcus carefully placed Margaret's locket and confession inside his father's fireproof box, along with Dr. Whitmore's testimony. Then he locked it and shoved it behind a stack of inventory boxes. Not perfect, but better than his shop safe. His phone buzzed. David Chen calling. Marcus, I got your message. What the hell is going on? My father was investigating the Wilson family when he died. David, he was murdered. This isn't just about Margaret Wilson anymore. This is about whatever the family is still hiding. A long silence. You need to go to the police. And tell them what? That I think my father was killed 3 years ago because of a Victorian mystery. They'll think I'm insane. Marcus paced the storage unit. I need evidence, real evidence that connects my father's death to the Wilson family. How are you going to get that? By finding out who the Wilson descendants are and what they're so desperate to hide. The next morning, Marcus began what felt like the most dangerous research of his life. If the Wilson family was still active, still powerful enough to threaten people investigating their history, they would have left traces, property records, business registrations, trust documents. He started with the obvious, searching for Wilson Family Trust in company registrations. The trust that maintained Margaret's grave was managed by Whitmore and Associates, but who benefited from it? Trust documents were typically private, but sometimes property ownership created public records. Marcus spent hours at the Land Registry Office, searching for properties owned by Wilson-related trusts or companies. He found 3, a townhouse in Kensington, a country estate in Surrey, and a commercial property in London's financial district. The Kensington townhouse was listed under Belgrave Holdings Limited. The address, 47 Belgrave Square. The same house where Margaret had killed her husband and been murdered herself 136 years ago. Someone still owned it. Someone still lived there. Marcus's next stop was Company's House, where he could access information about Belgrave Holdings directors and shareholders. The company had been established in 1920, nearly 40 years after Margaret's death. The current director was listed as Victoria Ashford, with a business address in Mayfair. He searched for Victoria Ashford online and found a professional profile on LinkedIn. Victoria Ashford, heritage property consultant, specializing in preservation of historic family estates and private collections. Her photograph showed a woman in her late 40s with sharp features and calculating eyes. The profile listed her education, Oxford history degree, and her professional experience managing estates for select private clients. No mention of the Wilson family, but the Belgrave Square address appeared in the property section of her portfolio. Marcus took a deep breath and called the number listed on her website. Ashford Heritage Consultancy. The voice was crisp, professional. Ms. Ashford, my name is Marcus Webb. I'm an antiques dealer specializing in Victorian pieces. I've recently acquired an item with provenance connected to 47 Belgrave Square, and I wondered if you might be interested in discussing its historical significance. A pause. What kind of item? A gold locket, circa 1887, with the initials M.W. The silence that followed was so long, Marcus thought the call had disconnected. When Victoria Ashford spoke again, her voice had changed. colder, more controlled. Mr. Webb, where did you acquire this item? Portobello Market, estate sale. The family wanted it destroyed, but it ended up in circulation anyway. Another pause. I see. Mr. Webb, I would very much like to see this locket. Are you available to meet this afternoon? Your office? No, somewhere more private. The Serpentine Gallery in Hyde Park, 2 p.m. There's a bench near the east entrance. I'll find you. She hung up before Marcus could respond. Marcus arrived at Hyde Park at 1:45, deliberately early. He wanted to observe Victoria Ashford before she spotted him. Wanted to see if she came alone or brought reinforcements. His father's journal had made him paranoid, but paranoia seemed justified when people were sending death threats. He positioned himself near the Serpentine Gallery with a clear view of the east entrance, pretending to read a newspaper while watching everyone who approached. At exactly 2 p.m., a black Mercedes pulled up, the same type of car his father had mentioned being followed by. Victoria Ashford stepped out, elegant in a dark wool coat, carrying a leather briefcase. She was alone, at least visibly. But Marcus noticed a man in a gray jacket lingering near the parking area, his attention focused on Victoria's movements. Security? Or something more threatening? Victoria spotted Marcus immediately, as if she'd known exactly what he looked like despite never having met. She walked toward the bench with confident strides. Mr. Webb, she didn't offer her hand. You have the locket? In a safe place. Her jaw tightened. You said you wanted to discuss its historical significance. I assume that means you've examined it thoroughly. I have, including what's inside. Victoria Ashford's careful composure cracked for just a moment. A flash of anger quickly suppressed. I see. Then you understand why this item should never have left family control. Family control? Are you a Wilson descendant? I represent the family's interests. The Wilson name may have died out, but their legacy is still protected by those who understand what's at stake. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a leather checkbook. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for the locket and everything you found inside it. Cash payment, complete confidentiality. Marcus whistled softly. That's a lot of money for a Victorian trinket. It's a generous offer for an item of primarily sentimental value. The family wishes to preserve Mrs. Wilson's privacy, even posthumously. Margaret Wilson's privacy? Or the family's reputation? Victoria's eyes narrowed. Mr. Webb, you're playing a dangerous game. That locket contains private family matters that have no bearing on anyone living today. Publishing Margaret Wilson's confession would serve no purpose except sensationalism. What about the truth? What about Edmund Wilson murdering her with arsenic? What about Charles Wilson's criminal activities? Victoria stood abruptly. Careful, Mr. Webb. Making unfounded accusations about deceased individuals can be legally problematic. Defamation law doesn't require the target to be living if the statements harm surviving family interests. So it's a threat now. First text messages, now legal action. Her expression shifted, genuine confusion. Text messages? I don't know what you're talking about. Marcus studied her face. She seemed genuinely surprised, which meant either she was an excellent liar or someone else was threatening him. Someone sent me a threatening message yesterday, Marcus said carefully. Told me to stop digging into the Wilson family. Victoria sat back down, her professional mask slipping. That wasn't me. My methods are more direct, as you can see. She paused. Mr. Webb, I think we're both in more danger than we realized. What do you mean? I represent the Wilson family's legitimate interests, preservation of historical properties, management of trusts, protection of reputation. But there are others who have, she chose her words carefully, different stakes in keeping Wilson family secrets buried. What kind of stakes? Charles Wilson's textile business was a front for opium importation. He worked with Chinese criminal syndicates in the 1880s. When he died, his brother Edmund took over the operation. The Wilson family wasn't just wealthy, they were connected to organized crime for 3 generations. That ended in the 1950s when the last direct descendant died, but what? But the business relationships didn't end. The shipping routes, the financial networks, the international connections, they were passed down, inherited by other families. Some of those families are still operating today, still moving illegal goods through channels established by Charles Wilson in the 1880s. Marcus felt his pulse racing. And they don't want attention drawn to their origins. Exactly. My job is to protect the Wilson family's historical reputation. Their job is to eliminate any evidence connecting modern criminal operations to Victorian ancestors. We have very different methods. Did you know about my father? Victoria's face paled. Your father? Richard Webb. He died 3 years ago, investigating the Wilson family. The official report said heart attack, but I think he was murdered. Victoria closed her briefcase slowly. Mr. Webb, I didn't know. I only took over the Wilson account 2 years ago, when my predecessor retired. But if your father was investigating the criminal connections, someone killed him. Yes, and that same someone is probably the one who sent you that text message. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the implications. Finally, Victoria spoke. I can't help you prove who killed your father, but I can give you information that might protect you. The modern operation is run by a man named Chen. Marcus's blood turned to ice. Chen? Simon Chen. He owns shipping companies throughout Asia and Europe, legitimate businesses with illegitimate cargo. His grandfather worked with Edmund Wilson in the 1920s. The families have been connected for a century. Marcus thought of Mrs. Chen at Portobello Market, the woman who'd sold him the locket, the woman who'd told him the family wanted it destroyed. Was she connected, or was it coincidence? Why are you telling me this? Marcus asked. Because unlike Simon Chen, I don't believe in murder to protect secrets. I think the truth should come out, carefully, properly, through historical channels that don't threaten living people. Margaret Wilson deserves to have her story told, but you need to understand what you're up against. She pulled a business card from her briefcase and wrote something on the back. This is my personal number. If anything happens, if you feel threatened, if someone approaches you, if you find evidence connecting Chen to your father's death, call me immediately. Why should I trust you? Victoria stood, shouldering her briefcase. Because I'm offering you information that could get me killed too, Mr. Webb. That's not something I do lightly. She walked away toward the black Mercedes. The man in the gray jacket materialized from nowhere and opened the car door for her. Within seconds, they were gone. Marcus sat on the bench for a long time, his mind racing. Mrs. Chen had given him the locket. David Chen was his trusted friend and expert jeweler. Simon Chen was apparently a crime boss protecting century-old secrets. How many Chens were involved in this nightmare, and which ones could he trust? Back at his shop, Marcus found David Chen waiting outside, looking worried. You didn't answer your phone. I got concerned after that text message you forwarded. Marcus unlocked the door, ushering David inside quickly. We need to talk about your family. David's expression shifted from concern to confusion. My family? What do they have to do with this? Do you know someone named Simon Chen? David's face went pale. My cousin. We don't speak. Haven't for 20 years. Marcus, why are you asking about Simon? Because apparently he's connected to the Wilson family's criminal operations, and I think he might have killed my father. David sank into a chair, looking suddenly much older than his 62 years. Simon's involved in shipping, import-export. The family always suspected it wasn't entirely legitimate, but we never asked questions. When my father died, Simon offered to help with the jewelry business. I refused, and we had a falling out. What kind of falling out? The kind where he told me I'd regret refusing his generosity. The kind where I started keeping weapons in my studio and looking over my shoulder. Marcus felt the weight of the situation crushing down on him. His closest ally in this investigation was related to the man who might have killed his father. The coincidences were too many, too convenient. David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Always. Did you know about the locket before I brought it to you? Did Simon tell you to watch for it? David stood up, his face a mixture of hurt and anger. You think I'm working with Simon? Marcus, I haven't spoken to that man in 2 decades. I chose my path. He chose his. We're family by blood only. But Mrs. Chen is my aunt, yes, my father's sister. But she doesn't speak to Simon either. The family split when Simon's father got involved with the wrong people in Hong Kong in the 1990s. Half of us chose legitimate businesses. Half chose crime. We don't mix. Marcus studied David's face, looking for any sign of deception. He found only genuine pain. I believe you, Marcus said finally. But we have a problem. If Simon knows I have the locket and he knows you've been helping me, you're in danger too. David nodded slowly. Then we need to finish this, quickly, before Simon makes a move. I'm going to publish Margaret Wilson's story, everything, the murder, the confession, the criminal connections. Once it's public, there's no reason to threaten us anymore. Unless Simon doesn't want the historical connections to his modern operations revealed, David countered. Publishing might just escalate things. Marcus's phone buzzed. Another text from an unknown number. Hyde Park meeting observed. Victoria Ashford is not your friend. Trust no one. You have 48 hours to destroy the locket and all evidence, or people you care about will suffer, starting with David Chen. Marcus showed the message to David, watching the color drain from his friend's face. They're watching me, David whispered. They know I'm involved. Then we go to the police. Now! We show them everything. My father's journal, the threats, the Wilson family connections. Will they believe us? A Victorian locket and some threatening texts? They'll have to, because in 48 hours, if we don't act, one of us might be dead. Marcus gathered his father's journal, photographs of the threatening texts, and Victoria Ashford's business card. He left the locket itself hidden in the storage unit. If Simon Chen wanted it destroyed, Marcus would make sure it stayed safe until the truth came out. As they locked up the shop and headed toward the nearest police station, Marcus noticed a black Mercedes parked across the street. The same car Victoria had arrived in. Or a different one. How many people were watching him? David noticed his hesitation. What is it? Someone's following us. Don't look directly, but there's a Mercedes. The car pulled away suddenly, disappearing into traffic before Marcus could get a plate number. Maybe we're being paranoid, David suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Or maybe we're not being paranoid enough. At the police station, they asked to speak with the detective about a potential murder case. After 20 minutes of waiting, they were led to a small interview room where Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison listened to their story with an expression that shifted from skeptical to genuinely concerned. Let me make sure I understand, D.I. Morrison said, reviewing her notes. You believe your father was murdered 3 years ago while investigating a Victorian-era crime family. You've recently acquired evidence of that family's criminal activities, and you're now being threatened by someone you believe is a modern descendant or associate of that family. Yes, Marcus said. I know it sounds insane, but actually, it doesn't sound as insane as you might think. D.I. Morrison pulled out a file from her desk drawer. We've been investigating Simon Chen's shipping operations for 2 years. Money laundering, suspected human trafficking, possible drug importation. But he's extremely careful, extremely well-connected, and we've never been able to build a solid case. Marcus and David exchanged glances. If what you're telling me is true, Morrison continued, this could finally give us leverage. Historical evidence connecting Chen's organization to documented criminal activities could help establish a pattern. It's not enough for arrest, but it's a starting point. She leaned forward, her expression serious. But I need to be completely honest with you both. If Chen is willing to kill to protect these secrets, going public might not stop him. It might just make him more desperate. I can offer you police protection, but... Her phone rang. She answered, her face darkening as she listened. When? A pause. Yes. Send units immediately. She hung up and looked at Marcus with an expression that made his stomach drop. Mr. Webb, there's been a fire at a storage facility in Clerkenwell. The unit registered to your name. Fire crews are on scene now, but... Marcus didn't hear the rest. His father's journal. The locket. Margaret Wilson's confession. Dr. Whitmore's testimony. Everything was in that storage unit, and now it was all burning. Chapter 4. No backups, no safety net. The fire crews were still working when Marcus arrived at the storage facility, their hoses creating clouds of steam as water met burning metal and wood. Detective Inspector Morrison had driven him there personally, and Marcus watched in silence as flames consumed Unit 47, and with it, every piece of physical evidence that could prove Margaret Wilson's story. Accelerant was used, one of the fire investigators told Morrison. Professional job, meant to burn hot enough to destroy everything completely. Marcus felt numb. The locket, Margaret's confession, Dr. Whitmore's testimony, his father's journal, all of it, gone. Not damaged, not recoverable, gone. David Chen stood beside him, his face ashen. Marcus, I'm so sorry. I was so careful, Marcus said, his voice hollow. I thought hiding everything in one place, away from my shop, would keep it safe. Instead, I made it easy for them. He turned to Morrison. Do you have security footage? Morrison nodded grimly. We've got a man on camera, hat low, scarf covering his face, but he made one mistake, turned directly toward a camera while leaving. We got a partial facial scan, running it through databases now. How long? Could be hours, could be days. Facial recognition isn't instant like it is on TV. Marcus pulled out his phone and looked at the photographs he'd taken of Margaret's confession and Dr. Whitmore's testimony. digital images on a phone screen, the only evidence that remained. But would anyone believe them? A good lawyer would claim they were fabricated, photoshopped, invented by a grieving son obsessed with conspiracy theories. "We need to go to Blackwell's office," Marcus said suddenly. "He made copies of Dr. Whitmore's papers. If those still exist—" "Already thought of that," Morrison interrupted. "I called Blackwell an hour ago. His office was broken into last night. Someone bypassed their security system and went straight to the Wilson family trust files. They're gone too." Marcus felt the last thread of hope snap. "So we have nothing." No physical evidence, no backup copies, nothing that would stand up in court or convince a newspaper to publish. "We have you," Morrison said. "You're a witness to what you found. That counts for something." "A witness with no evidence is just a person with a story." Marcus shook his head. "Simon Chen won. He destroyed everything." His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Against every instinct screaming at him not to, Marcus opened the message. "The fire was regrettable but necessary. However, you're thinking too much like an antiques dealer. Physical objects can be destroyed. But information? Information wants to be free. Ask yourself, where did Dr. Whitmore's testimony come from originally? Who preserved it for 100+ years? Lawyers keep records, even of records. VA, Victoria Ashford." Marcus read the message twice, then a third time. "Morrison, when Blackwell gave me the documents, did he mention how long his firm has had them?" "He said Dr. Whitmore deposited them in 1889 when his firm was founded." "And firms keep records of everything they receive, right? Intake logs, cataloging systems." Morrison's eyes widened. "The original documents are gone, but there should be administrative records showing what was received, when, and basic descriptions of contents. It's not the same as having the testimony itself, but it proves the documents existed, that I didn't make them up." Marcus felt a spark of hope. "Can you get access to those records?" "I can get a warrant for business records related to an ongoing criminal investigation. But Marcus, administrative logs won't contain the actual information from the testimony. They'll just prove something was deposited. It won't tell us what Edmund Wilson did or confirm Simon Chen's family connections." "Then we need to find another way to connect the dots." Marcus thought hard. "Victoria said information wants to be free. Dr. Whitmore deposited those documents in 1889. What if he told someone else about them? Family, colleagues?" David spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "Medical journals, Victorian physicians publish case studies all the time, sometimes disguised to protect patient identity. If Dr. Whitmore suspected arsenic poisoning in both Charles and Margaret Wilson, he might have written about it." Morrison pulled out her phone. "I'll have research team check medical archives from 1887 to 1890 for any articles by Harrison Whitmore about arsenic poisoning." They spent the next 6 hours at the British Library, Marcus and David searching through digitized Victorian medical journals while Morrison coordinated with her team. The work was tedious. Thousands of pages, archaic terminology, handwritten notes that required intense focus to decipher. At 4 p.m., David found something. "Marcus, look at this." It was an article in the London Medical Gazette from March 1888, titled "Observations on Domestic Arsenic Poisoning, a Case Study of Marital Violence, Concealed by Convenient Diagnosis." The author, Dr. H. Whitmore. Marcus read quickly, his heart pounding. "I present the case of a married woman, age 27, who consulted me regularly between 1880, 1887 with injuries she attributed to domestic accidents. Over 7 years, I documented 17 separate incidents requiring medical attention, including fractured bones, severe contusions, and internal trauma consistent with violent assault. Each time, I recorded her explanations and said nothing, complicit through my silence. In 1887, the woman's husband died suddenly. The attending physician, myself, diagnosed cardiac failure. Symptoms, however, were consistent with acute arsenic poisoning, severe gastrointestinal distress, muscle weakness, cardiovascular collapse. I made no official report. 2 years later, the widow herself died of what I diagnosed as consumption. In truth, I observed clear symptoms of chronic arsenic exposure: skin lesions, neurological deterioration, organ failure. Someone was slowly poisoning her, likely the deceased husband's brother, who stood to inherit her considerable wealth. Again, I remain silent. I write this not as confession, but as condemnation of a system that offers women no protection from violent husbands and physicians, no recourse when witnessing domestic crimes. The woman in question killed her husband to save her own life, then accepted her own murder as divine punishment. Both deaths are on my conscience. The article didn't name Margaret or Charles Wilson, but the details matched perfectly. Marcus photographed every page. "This is it," he said, voice shaking. "This is proof that Dr. Whitmore's testimony was real. He published this 6 months after Charles Wilson died. If we can connect the timeline and details to the Wilson case—" "We can prove your story isn't fabricated," Morrison finished. "This was published in a legitimate medical journal in 1888. It's archived, cataloged, and verifiable." David was already searching for more articles. If Dr. Whitmore published once, he might have published again. 30 minutes later, they found a second article from 1889, this one more explicit. "On the criminal networks enabled by legitimate business, a physician's perspective." Dr. Whitmore wrote about treating wealthy London merchants who used their businesses as fronts for criminal activity. He described one patient, a textile merchant with shipping connections to China, whose sudden death from cardiac failure occurred under suspicious circumstances. The merchant in question had built an empire on opium importation disguised within legal textile trading. Upon his death, his brother inherited both the legitimate business and the criminal operations. The brother subsequently married and expanded the network significantly. Again, no names. But the details matched Charles and Edmund Wilson exactly. Marcus felt vindication surging through him. These articles are proof. Combined with the church records, Margaret's missing person report, the bank embezzlement case, we can reconstruct the entire story even without the physical locket. Morrison was already on her phone, coordinating with her team. When she hung up, her expression was serious. "We've got the facial recognition result from the storage facility fire. The man is Wei Zhang, known associate of Simon Chen. He has outstanding warrants in Hong Kong for arson and murder. This gives us probable cause to bring Chen in for questioning." "Will it stick?" David asked. "Maybe not immediately, but it's leverage. And combined with Dr. Whitmore's published articles and the Wilson family history, it's enough to open a formal investigation into Chen's business operations." Marcus's phone buzzed again. Victoria Ashford. "You found the medical journals. Good. Now you need to find the house. 47 Belgrave Square. Tonight, 11 p.m., the property will be empty for exactly 2 hours during a shift change in security. Whatever physical evidence still exists from 1887, it's there. This is your only chance. Come alone or don't come at all." Marcus showed the message to Morrison. "Absolutely not," she said immediately. "This is obviously a trap." "Or it's the last chance to find something Chen hasn't destroyed yet," Marcus countered. "If there's any physical evidence still in that house, documents, letters, anything Margaret or Dr. Whitmore might have hidden, it could be the final piece we need. Then we go in with a warrant and a full team. And by the time you navigate the legal process, Chen will know about it, and anything worth finding will be gone." Marcus met her eyes. "I'm going. You can either back me up or not, but I'm going." Morrison studied him for a long moment. "If I let you do this and you die, I'll lose my badge and you'll be dead. Those are the stakes. If I don't do this, my father died for nothing, and Margaret Wilson's story stays buried. Those are the stakes that matter to me." At 10:45 p.m., Marcus stood across the street from 47 Belgrave Square, watching the elegant Victorian townhouse that had been home to Margaret and Charles Wilson 138 years ago. Lights were off. The street was quiet. Somewhere nearby, Morrison had positioned 3 plainclothes officers, though Marcus didn't know where. His phone buzzed. "Service entrance, rear of property. Door will be unlocked. You have 90 minutes before security returns." Marcus crossed the street and made his way to the back of the property. True to Victoria's word, the service door was unlocked. He slipped inside, using his phone's flashlight to navigate. The interior was pristine, restored to Victorian grandeur but clearly uninhabited. Furniture sat beneath dust covers. The air smelled of old wood and preservation chemicals. Marcus moved quickly through the ground floor. Kitchen, servants' quarters, dining room. Nothing. Upstairs, the bedrooms were equally bare. But in what would have been the master bedroom, where Margaret and Charles had slept, where Charles had likely beaten her, where Margaret had perhaps planned his murder, Marcus found something that made his breath catch. A section of wallpaper near the closet looked newer than the surrounding walls. Not obvious unless you were looking for it, but to Marcus's trained eye, clearly replaced at some point. He carefully pulled at the edge and found it wasn't glued down at all. Behind it was a small opening in the plaster, and inside that opening was a wooden box. Marcus's hands shook as he opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them tied with ribbon. The handwriting on the first envelope. "To whoever finds this. From Margaret A. Wilson, October 1888. He opened the letter and began reading by phone light. I write this 1 year after my husband's death and 1 year before what I know will be my own. Edmund Wilson is poisoning me, slowly, carefully. Dr. Whitmore has tried to help, but I refuse treatment. I deserve this punishment for what I did to Charles. But I cannot let Edmund inherit everything and continue Charles's criminal work unpunished. These letters contain evidence, shipping manifests showing opium quantities, financial records proving bribes to customs officials, names of Edmund's partners in Hong Kong, including the Chen family. If you find this, please ensure it reaches authorities who will act. Marcus photographed every letter, every document, bank records, shipping manifests, names and addresses, evidence that had been hidden in this wall for 137 years, preserved by a dying woman determined that the truth would eventually surface. He was photographing the last document when he heard footsteps downstairs. Marcus froze, listening. Multiple sets of footsteps. Voices speaking Cantonese, not security, not police. He'd been set up. Marcus moved quickly to the bedroom window, looking for escape routes. 3 stories up, no obvious way down. The footsteps were coming up the stairs. His phone buzzed silently. Morrison's text. "We see them! 4 men, armed! Stay quiet! We're moving in!" But the men were already on the landing. Marcus had seconds. He did the only thing he could think of. He carefully placed Margaret's letters back in the hidden compartment, closed the wooden box, and stepped away from the wall. If they were going to kill him, they wouldn't find what he'd found. The photographs were already automatically backed up to cloud storage. The evidence would survive even if he didn't. The bedroom door opened. 3 men entered, led by someone Marcus recognized from newspaper photos. Simon Chen himself, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, looking more like a businessman than a crime lord. "Mr. Webb," Chen said calmly, "I admire persistence, but you should have accepted my warnings." "Warnings? You killed my father." "Your father was careless. He met with people he shouldn't have trusted, made accusations he couldn't prove. You're making the same mistakes." Chen moved further into the room. "What were you looking for here?" "The truth about your family's partnership with the Wilsons. How you've been running criminal operations for 4 generations using businesses established in the 1880s. Chen smiled slightly. "Bold accusations from a man with no evidence. Everything you had burned in that storage facility. Everything Blackwell had is gone. You have nothing but theories." "I have Dr. Whitmore's published medical articles from 1888 and 1889 describing both Charles Wilson's murder and Edmund Wilson's criminal operations. I have church records showing Margaret Wilson's marriage. I have police reports documenting her disappearance and the bank embezzlement case involving Thomas Miller." Marcus kept his voice steady. "And I have police outside this house right now, surrounding it." Chen's smile disappeared. "You're lying." "Am I?" Marcus gestured toward the window. "Look for yourself." The moment Chen's men turned toward the window, the room flooded with light. Police flashlights from outside, Morrison's amplified voice. "Armed police! Drop your weapons! Exit the building with hands visible." Chen's expression transformed from confident to furious in an instant. He grabbed Marcus, pulling out a knife. "We're walking out of here together. You're my insurance." But Marcus had spent 3 years preparing for confrontation with his father's killer. He'd trained, he'd planned, and he wasn't going to let Chen walk away. He drove his elbow backward into Chen's ribs, twisted away from the knife, and threw himself toward the door. Chen's men moved to block him, but the window exploded inward as police deployed gas canisters. The room filled with tear gas. Marcus couldn't see, couldn't breathe, but he kept moving toward where he remembered the door being. Someone grabbed him. He swung blindly. And then he was being pulled down the stairs by strong hands, out through the front entrance into cold night air. Morrison's face appeared above him. "You're an idiot, Webb! But you got them!" Behind her, police were dragging 4 men out of the house in handcuffs. Simon Chen, for the first time in his life, didn't look like he was in control. "The letters!" Marcus gasped, still coughing from the gas. "In the bedroom, hidden behind the wallpaper by the closet. Margaret Wilson's evidence." Morrison radioed to the forensics team. Then she looked at Marcus seriously. "Victoria Ashford set this up. She told both you and Chen to come here tonight. Why?" Marcus thought about it. "Because she needed us both in the same place. She gave me evidence through the medical journals. She told Chen I'd be here alone. She made sure the police knew. She orchestrated the entire confrontation because she wanted Chen arrested, but needed him to make a move aggressive enough to justify the arrest," Morrison finished. "She played both sides. Where is she? Gone. And given how carefully she planned this, I don't think we'll find her unless she wants to be found." Marcus looked up at 47 Belgrave Square, where Margaret Wilson had lived and died 137 years ago, where she'd killed her abusive husband, been murdered by his brother, and hidden evidence that would eventually bring down their descendants' criminal empire. She'd waited 137 years for justice, and tonight, finally, she'd gotten it. Chapter 5. The Last Wilson. Marcus stared at the elderly woman blocking the doorway of the secret room, his mind struggling to process what she'd just said. Eleanor Hayes, Margaret Wilson's great-great-niece, the one who'd orchestrated everything. "You set me up," Marcus said, his voice barely controlled. "The locket, Mrs. Chen. Everything. You used me." Eleanor's expression remained calm, almost sad. "I gave you the truth, Mr. Webb. What you chose to do with it was your decision." She stepped into the room, moving with surprising agility for her age. "But yes, I needed someone who would pursue the story relentlessly, someone who had personal stakes in exposing the Wilson Chen criminal empire. My father." The words came out like broken glass. "Your father was a good man who got too close to the truth 3 years ago. Simon Chen had him killed, just as Edmund Wilson killed my great-great-aunt Margaret." Eleanor gestured to the evidence cases surrounding them. "I've spent 40 years preparing this moment, gathering proof, waiting for the right person to carry the story forward." Marcus felt rage building. "You could have gone to the police yourself, published the evidence. Why drag me into this?" "Because I'm dying, Mr. Webb." Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact. "Pancreatic cancer, 6 months at most, and because Simon Chen has been watching me for decades, waiting for me to make a move. If I'd tried to expose the evidence myself, it would have been destroyed before anyone saw it. But you," she smiled slightly, "you were unknown to him, motivated, stubborn, perfect." "So I'm disposable," Marcus said bitterly. "So you're effective." Eleanor moved to the center evidence case and opened it carefully. Simon Chen destroyed every piece of documentary evidence he could find over the past 48 hours. But he doesn't know about this room. Dr. Whitmore was very clever. He built the space in 1890 when the house was being renovated after Margaret's death. Only 3 people knew it existed: Whitmore, his lawyer, and Margaret's sister Catherine. "Catherine Hayes," Marcus said, the pieces clicking together. "Your great-grandmother?" "Yes." The evidence passed down through the Hayes family, along with the story of how Margaret was murdered by Edmund Wilson and the Chen family. "We've been waiting 136 years for the right moment to destroy them." Marcus looked at the evidence surrounding him. Vials of Margaret's hair showing arsenic poisoning, letters in Edmund Wilson's handwriting discussing murder, financial ledgers documenting opium trafficking. Why now? Why not years ago? Because Simon Chen is more powerful now than his family has ever been. His shipping empire, his political connections, his criminal network, they're at their peak, which means he's also more exposed, more vulnerable. Eleanor lifted a leather-bound journal from the case. Dr. Whitmore's original testimony, the only copy that survived. Everything else has been destroyed, but this... She handed it to Marcus. "This can still bring him down." Marcus took the journal with shaking hands. The leather was aged, but well-preserved, the pages filled with Whitmore's precise handwriting. He opened to a random page and read, "I have documented 17 instances of Edmund Wilson and Chen Huang working together to traffic opium through their shipping operations. 1887-1895. The partnership has made both families enormously wealthy while destroying countless lives. More troubling is evidence that they murdered Margaret Wilson when she discovered their activities and threatened to expose them. I have collected samples proving arsenic poisoning, along with letters showing premeditation. But I cannot publish this information without destroying innocent descendants and risking my own life." Marcus looked up at Eleanor. Whitmore knew everything. Why didn't he act? Because Edmund Wilson and Chen Huang had friends in government, in police departments, in newspapers. Whitmore tried once to take his evidence to authorities in 1896. His office was burned down the next week. He nearly died. After that, he decided to preserve the evidence for future generations, hoping that someday society would be ready to hold powerful criminals accountable. Eleanor's eyes were fierce. "That day is today, Mr. Webb." Marcus heard footsteps on the stairs above, multiple sets moving quickly. "They've found us," Eleanor said calmly. "How?" Marcus demanded. "I imagine they've been tracking you since you left David Chen's studio. Simon is thorough, if nothing else." Eleanor moved to a wall panel and pressed a hidden switch. A section of wall slid open, revealing a narrow passage. This leads to the neighboring property's basement. Go now. What about you? I'm 83 and dying. They can't hurt me more than the cancer already is. She thrust Dr. Whitmore's journal into Marcus's hands. But you need to survive. That journal contains everything. Names, dates, evidence of murders spanning 5 generations. Get it to Detective Morrison. Make sure it goes public. Eleanor, go. She pushed him toward the passage. Margaret Wilson died trying to expose these monsters. Your father died investigating them. Don't let their deaths be meaningless. Marcus stumbled into the dark passage as footsteps thundered into the wine cellar behind him. He heard Eleanor's voice, calm and defiant. Gentlemen, I've been expecting you. The passage was narrow and pitch black, forcing Marcus to navigate by touch. He clutched the journal against his chest and ran, his shoulder scraping against rough stone walls. Behind him he heard shouting and Eleanor's laugh, sharp and mocking. The passage ended at a wooden door. Marcus threw his weight against it and burst into another basement, this one filled with modern heating equipment and storage boxes. He found stairs and climbed them, emerging into what appeared to be an elegant townhouse's kitchen. A startled woman in a bathrobe screamed, "Sorry!" Marcus ran past her toward the front door, ignoring her shouts. He burst onto Belgrave Square and ran, not looking back, his only thought to protect the journal Eleanor had entrusted to him. He was 3 blocks away when Morrison's body camera, still attached to his jacket, buzzed. A voice came through its small speaker. "Webb, where are you? Your signal just went live." Marcus pressed the camera's talk button. "Morrison, I have it. The evidence. Original documentation from 1890 proving the Wilson Chen murders and criminal operations. But they're after me. Where are you?" "Heading north on..." Marcus glanced at a street sign. "Wilton Crescent. On foot. Morrison, there's a woman back at the house, Eleanor Hayes. They might hurt her. We've got units converging on Belgrave Square now. Keep moving. I'm sending backup to your location." Marcus ran through the pre-dawn streets of London, the city just beginning to wake. The journal felt like it weighed 100 pounds, its burden more than just physical. This was 136 years of truth, lives destroyed and secrets buried, all condensed into one man's careful documentation. A black Mercedes turned onto the street ahead of him. Marcus recognized the pattern. They were boxing him in. He ducked into a narrow alley between buildings, his dress shoes slipping on wet cobblestones. The alley opened onto a small park. Marcus sprinted across it, his lungs burning. Behind him, he heard car doors slamming and footsteps giving chase. Professional footsteps, steady and relentless. He needed to lose them, but keep moving toward police backup. The streets were a maze, and Marcus's knowledge of this part of London was limited. He turned left, then right, following instinct more than strategy. Another Mercedes appeared at the end of the block. Marcus realized with cold certainty that they weren't trying to catch him immediately. They were herding him, directing him towards some specific location where they could take him quietly. He changed tactics, stopping in his tracks and reversing direction. The move surprised his pursuers. He saw 2 men in dark clothes hesitate before adjusting their approach. Marcus ran back the way he'd come, then turned down a side street he'd passed earlier. This street was busier, early morning commuters heading to work, delivery trucks making their rounds. Marcus pushed into the crowd, using bodies as cover. He ducked into a small cafe, startling the barista preparing for opening. "Back door," Marcus gasped. The barista pointed wordlessly. Marcus ran through the kitchen and out into another alley. This one led to a major thoroughfare, Knightsbridge, based on the landmarks Marcus recognized. He flagged down a black cab, throwing himself into the back seat. "Scotland Yard. Fast. Extra £100 if you get me there in 5 minutes. The driver's eyes lit up. "You running from someone?" "Yes, and I'm one of the good guys." The cab pulled into traffic with impressive speed. Marcus looked back through the rear window and saw the 2 men in dark clothes standing on the sidewalk, watching him escape. One of them lifted a phone to his ear. "They're calling ahead," Marcus muttered. "What's that?" the driver asked. "Nothing, just drive fast." Marcus used the body camera to contact Morrison again. "I'm in a cab heading to Scotland Yard, but they're going to intercept us. Can you send units to meet me en route?" "Already done. We've got 4 cars converging on your position. Webb, what did you find in that house?" Marcus looked down at the journal in his lap. "Everything. The complete history of the Wilson Chen criminal empire, documented by a Victorian physician who witnessed it all. Eleanor Hayes, she's Margaret Wilson's descendant. She's been preserving this evidence for 40 years. Hayes! We've got officers at 47 Belgrave Square now. There's no one in the basement, just some kind of hidden room with empty evidence cases." Marcus's blood ran cold. Eleanor was there 5 minutes ago. They must have taken her. Taken her where? I don't know. But Morrison, she's dying. Cancer. She said she had 6 months. If Simon Chen gets to her, we'll find her. Right now, my priority is keeping you and that journal safe. The cab turned onto Victoria Street, Scotland Yard, visible ahead. Marcus saw police cars flanking the intersection, Morrison's people providing escort. Relief flooded through him. Then the cab exploded. Not literally, but it felt like it. The vehicle shuddered violently and spun out of control, its rear tire shredded. The driver fought the wheel but couldn't prevent the cab from slamming into a parked car. Marcus's head cracked against the window. Stars burst across his vision. Through the pain and disorientation, he saw men approaching, not police, despite their official-looking jackets. The door was wrenched open. Hands grabbed him, pulling him from the cab. Marcus clutched the journal desperately, but someone struck him hard across the face. His grip weakened. "Give it to me, Mr. Webb." The voice was cultured, accented with British-Chinese inflection. "Give me the journal and this ends peacefully." Marcus looked up through blood and saw him for the first time. Simon Chen was perhaps 60, distinguished-looking in an expensive suit, his face showing traces of both British and Chinese heritage. His eyes were cold and calculating. "Go to hell," Marcus managed. Chen sighed. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable. Your father wasn't. He actually tried to fight us." He nodded to one of his men. "Search him." Rough hands patted Marcus down, finding the journal tucked inside his jacket. Chen took it almost reverently, flipping through pages. Dr. Whitmore's original testimony. I thought we destroyed every copy decades ago. He looked at Marcus with something like respect. "You're very persistent, Mr. Webb. Just like your father. It's a pity that persistence is fatal in your family." Police sirens were getting closer. Chen glanced at his men. "We're leaving. Bring him." Marcus tried to fight, but he was dazed from the crash and outnumbered. They dragged him toward a waiting van. Just before they could throw him inside, gunshots cracked through the morning air. Not aimed at Marcus, warning shots from police who'd finally arrived. Chen's men scattered, diving for cover. In the chaos, Marcus wrenched himself free and stumbled toward the police cars. Morrison grabbed him, pulling him behind a vehicle. "Are you hit?" "He has the journal," Marcus gasped. Chen took it. Morrison looked across the street where Chen's men were retreating into vehicles, laying down suppressing fire to cover their escape. Chen himself stood calmly by an open car door, the journal visible in his hand. He looked directly at Marcus and smiled. Then he got in the car and drove away. Marcus sagged against Morrison, watching 136 years of truth disappear into London traffic. "It's over. He won." "Maybe not," Morrison said. She held up a small device. "Your body camera recorded everything, including your entire conversation with Eleanor Hayes in the basement. We have her testimony, Chen's confession to murdering your father, and visual documentation of the evidence that was in that room." Marcus looked at her, hope stirring despite his exhaustion. "Is that enough?" "Combined with what we've been building independently." "Yes, we can finally arrest Simon Chen." She helped Marcus to his feet. "But Webb, he still has the physical journal. If he destroys it before we can recover it—" "He won't," Marcus said with sudden certainty. "He's too arrogant. He'll want to read it first, to understand exactly what evidence existed against his family. That gives us time." Morrison's phone rang. She answered, listened, and her face went from grim to shocked. "Say that again?" "When?" "Jesus." She hung up and looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't read. "Eleanor Hayes just walked into the National Crime Agency headquarters in Vauxhall. She's very much alive and demanding to speak with whoever's investigating the Wilson Chen organization." Marcus felt dizzy with relief and confusion. "But Chen's men took her." "Apparently not. She says she gave you the journal and then left through a different exit. She's been waiting at the NCA specifically because she knew you'd lead Chen's people away from her." Morrison shook her head in admiration. "That woman is tougher than all of us combined." 2 hours later, Marcus sat in an interview room at Scotland Yard with Morrison, Eleanor Hayes, and 2 NCA officers. Eleanor looked remarkably composed for someone who'd just orchestrated the exposure of a multi-generational criminal conspiracy. "I apologize for the deception, Mr. Webb," Eleanor said. "But I needed Chen to believe he'd recovered all the evidence. That's the only way he'd feel secure enough to make mistakes." "What mistakes?" Marcus asked. Eleanor smiled. "The journal he stole from you isn't Dr. Whitmore's original. It's a perfect replica I had made 6 months ago, filled with real testimony and evidence, but not the most damaging materials." She pulled a different journal from her bag, this one older and more worn. This is the original. It contains not just the historical crimes, but Dr. Whitmore's detailed accounting of the modern operations as of 1920, including the names and addresses of every family involved in continuing the Wilson Chen criminal enterprise. One of the NCA officers leaned forward. Names that we can trace to current criminal operations. 15 family lineages spanning Europe and Asia, all connected to shipping, import-export, and what we'd now call organized crime. Eleanor opened the journal to a specific page. Dr. Whitmore was extraordinarily thorough. He documented everything because he knew that someday someone would have the courage to use this information. Morrison studied the pages. This is going to take down more than just Simon Chen. This connects to operations in 6 countries. That's the point, Eleanor said quietly. Margaret Wilson died trying to expose one man's crimes. I won't let her sacrifice be wasted on anything less than destroying the entire network. Marcus looked at Eleanor with new understanding. You used yourself as bait, and me as the distraction. Also, Chen would think he'd won and stop looking for the real evidence. I'm dying anyway, Mr. Webb. I decided my final months should mean something. Eleanor's eyes held both sadness and fierce determination. Your father died investigating this family. Margaret died trying to escape it. Dr. Whitmore spent his life documenting it. The least I could do is make sure their efforts finally bore fruit. One of the NCA officers closed the journal carefully. Mrs. Hayes, this evidence will need to be authenticated and corroborated with modern investigative techniques. But if everything you've told us checks out, it will, Eleanor interrupted. I've spent 40 years verifying every detail. The evidence is solid. Morrison looked at Marcus. What about you, Webb? Are you willing to testify about everything you experienced over the past few days? Marcus thought about his father, about Margaret Wilson, about Eleanor's brave gambit and Dr. Whitmore's lifetime of careful documentation. Yes, whatever it takes to finish this. Good. Morrison stood. Because Simon Chen doesn't know yet that the journal he stole is a replica. We've got maybe 24 hours before he realizes he's been deceived. In that time, we need to coordinate with international law enforcement, prepare arrest warrants for multiple countries, and gather enough corroborating evidence to make charges stick. Will 24 hours be enough? Marcus asked. Morrison smiled grimly. It'll have to be, because once Chen realizes the truth, he'll run, and men like him have resources to disappear forever. Eleanor stood slowly, her age suddenly visible in her movements. If I might make a suggestion, Chen will want to verify the journal's authenticity. He'll compare it to records his family has kept. When he discovers discrepancies, he'll know he was deceived and will either flee or destroy evidence. So we move fast, one of the NCA officers said. Or, Eleanor said thoughtfully, we let him think he's still winning. Feed him information that confirms the journal is genuine. Keep him complacent while we build our case. Marcus looked at her with grudging admiration. You've been planning this for a very long time. 40 years, Eleanor confirmed. Ever since I learned what really happened to Margaret Wilson. Ever since I realized that the families responsible were still profiting from murder and suffering. She looked at each person in the room. I don't expect to live to see the trials. My cancer is aggressive. But I will die knowing that I finally finished what my great-great-aunt started, bringing truth to light no matter how long it took. Morrison's phone buzzed. She read the message and looked up with an expression of urgent intensity. Chen's people just raided David Chen's jewelry studio. David's unharmed. He was at a police safe house. But they trashed the entire place looking for the Locket replica he made. Marcus felt ice in his chest. They know? Somehow they know that we have more evidence than what was in the journal. Or they're being thorough, Morrison countered. Either way, we're out of time for careful planning. We move now, arrest everyone simultaneously before they can scatter. The next hours became a blur of coordination. Marcus watched as Morrison and the NCA officers orchestrated what they described as the largest coordinated operation targeting organized crime in British history. Arrest warrants were issued, surveillance teams mobilized, and international partners notified. Marcus himself was placed in protective custody, not in a safe house this time, but in a guarded room at Scotland Yard. He used the time to write everything down. His entire investigation, every person he'd encountered, every piece of evidence he'd seen. David Chen joined him late in the afternoon, looking exhausted but unharmed. They destroyed 40 years of my work, David said quietly. Every tool, every piece of equipment, my grandfather's anvils, my father's jeweler's loop, all smashed. I'm sorry, Marcus said. Don't be. If destroying my studio means destroying Simon, it's worth it. David managed to smile. Besides, insurance will cover the equipment. And the really important things, my skills, my knowledge, they can't destroy those. As evening fell, Morrison brought news. We've arrested 47 people across 5 countries in coordinated raids. Simon Chen was taken into custody at his Mayfair office 2 hours ago. He's currently refusing to speak without lawyers present. Did you recover the journal? Marcus asked. Found it in his office safe, along with approximately £2 million in cash and documents detailing current criminal operations. Morrison allowed herself a satisfied smile. He kept everything, every record of every crime. Arrogance, it turns out, is a criminal's worst enemy. Marcus felt emotion overwhelming him, relief, vindication, grief for his father who hadn't lived to see this moment. What happens now? Now we build cases that will hold up in court. Chen has resources for excellent legal defense, and we need to ensure every piece of evidence is properly documented and authenticated. Morrison sat down across from Marcus. But Webb, we did it. The Wilson-Chen criminal network that's been operating for 136 years is finished. Margaret Wilson's story will finally be told. Eleanor Hayes appeared in the doorway, looking frail but triumphant. Detective Morrison is correct. Whatever happens in the courts, the truth is out now. Newspapers are already requesting interviews. Historians are asking for access to Dr. Whitmore's testimony. Margaret's sacrifice won't be forgotten. Marcus looked at the elderly woman who'd manipulated him, used him, and ultimately trusted him with the most important mission of her life. Thank you, he said simply, for everything, for believing I'd see this through. Eleanor smiled. You had no choice, Mr. Webb. You're your father's son, and men like your father don't quit, even when quitting would be smarter. She settled into a chair, looking suddenly exhausted. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to rest. Destroying criminal empires is tiring work at 83. As Eleanor dozed in the chair, as David made phone calls about rebuilding his studio, as Morrison coordinated with prosecutors about upcoming trials, Marcus finally allowed himself to breathe. The weight he'd been carrying for 3 years, the weight of his father's unsolved murder, of unanswered questions and buried truth, had finally lifted. Margaret Wilson could rest now. Dr. Whitmore's life work had meaning. Eleanor Hayes could die knowing she'd honored her family's legacy, and Marcus's father had been vindicated. The truth, it turned out, was worth waiting 136 years to discover, and worth every risk to bring into the light. Chapter 6. Margaret's Legacy. 6 months later, Marcus Webb stood in the newly renovated exhibition hall at the Victoria and Albert Museum, staring at the gold locket mounted in a climate-controlled display case. Beside it lay Dr. Whitmore's original journal, carefully preserved and photographed for the exhibit. Margaret Wilson's wedding portrait hung on the wall, the one Eleanor Hayes had discovered in 47 Belgrave Square, showing a young woman's haunted eyes beneath a carefully constructed smile. The museum's director, Dr. Catherine Winters, stood beside him, reviewing the exhibition materials. This is going to be one of our most significant exhibits, she said quietly. Not just because of the historical importance, but because it's a story of courage that resonates today. Women like Margaret Wilson are often forgotten or romanticized. You've given her back her voice. The exhibition was titled Hidden Messages, Margaret Wilson's Truth. It documented not just Margaret's story, but the broader investigation that had finally brought her murderers to justice. The narrative arc moved from Victorian crime through Dr. Whitmore's meticulous documentation to modern-day investigation and ultimate accountability. Opening day drew hundreds of visitors, historians, criminologists, descendants of families involved in the case, journalists, and ordinary people interested in Victorian crime. The museum had prepared carefully for the media frenzy. Marcus gave interviews throughout the day, but his mind kept returning to Eleanor Hayes. She'd died 3 weeks ago, exactly at the 6-month mark she'd predicted. She'd lived long enough to see the exhibition opening, to know that Margaret's story would be preserved in one of the world's most prestigious institutions. At Eleanor's funeral, attended by Marcus, David Chen, and Detective Inspector Morrison, her great-niece, had read Eleanor's final letter. I spent 40 years waiting for this moment. 40 years, preserving evidence, gathering strength, planning how to finally expose the truth. I never expected to live long enough to see Margaret's face in a museum, her voice finally heard after 136 years of silence. But I did. That's enough. That's everything. Tell Marcus Webb that he fulfilled his father's mission. Richard was looking for truth, and he found it. Through his son, Margaret Wilson can finally rest. The trials began 3 months after Eleanor's death. Simon Chen faced charges spanning 5 continents: murder, racketeering, money laundering, human trafficking, and conspiracy. The prosecution presented evidence from Dr. Whitmore's testimony, modern forensic analysis, and testimony from Marcus and others involved in the investigation. Chen's legal team mounted an aggressive defense, claiming that the historical evidence was inadmissible, unreliable, and prejudicial. They argued that prosecuting modern crimes based on century-old testimony was fundamentally unjust. But the British Crown Prosecution Service had built a comprehensive case that didn't rely solely on historical evidence. Modern shipping records connected Chen's operations to the original Wilson Chen infrastructure. Financial analysis traced criminal proceeds back through decades of operations. Testimony from former employees and associates implicated Chen in contemporary crimes. The trials lasted 8 months. The verdict came on a gray London morning in February. Guilty on all counts. Simon Chen was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. 23 other defendants received sentences ranging from 5 years to life, effectively dismantling a criminal empire that had operated for over a century. Marcus attended the sentencing, sitting in the gallery as Chen was led away. Their eyes met across the courtroom for just a moment. Chen's expression held no remorse, only calculation, already assessing his options, his power, his remaining resources. But for the first time, that power had limits. After the verdict, Detective Inspector Morrison found Marcus outside the courthouse. "Your father would be proud," she said. "I know," Marcus replied. "But I keep thinking about all the years he spent investigating before he died. All the years before Eleanor found a way forward. How many other cases are out there like this? How many people died for truths that no one ever discovered?" Morrison didn't have an answer, but she understood the weight of that question. 3 months after Chen's sentencing, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He sold Webb & Sons Antiques. David Chen helped him arrange the sale to a younger dealer who had the energy and fresh perspective the business needed. The shop on Kensington had been Marcus's inheritance, his father's life work, but it had also been a trap, holding him in place, bound to the past. "What will you do now?" David asked as they packed the final boxes. "I'm not sure yet," Marcus admitted. "But I need to do something different. Something that makes what happened to my father mean more than just solving one case." David smiled. "You're going to do something dangerous, aren't you?" "Probably." 6 months after the trial, Marcus took the position of Historical Investigations Consultant for the National Crime Agency. His job, to identify historical crimes where new evidence or modern investigative techniques could finally bring perpetrators to justice. It was a niche position, created specifically for him, because his work with the Wilson Chen case had demonstrated the power of historical investigation. His first major assignment came from the Metropolitan Police, reopening unsolved murders from 1890, 1920, cases where physical evidence still existed in archives or evidence rooms. Modern forensic analysis, DNA testing, and digital investigation could potentially solve crimes that had seemed impossible decades ago. 2 years after Chapter 4, after Simon Chen's arrest and imprisonment, Marcus found himself in Edinburgh, consulting on a murder case from 1907. He was meeting with local historical societies, reviewing archive documents, applying lessons learned from the Wilson investigation. His phone rang. It was David Chen. "Marcus, you need to see something. It just came across my desk at the studio." David had taken over the family jewelry business from his father and had become a specialist in Victorian jewelry restoration. Just the month before, he'd received a commission from an estate sale company to examine a collection of jewelry being liquidated. "What is it?" Marcus asked. "Another locket, identical mechanism to Margaret Wilson's, same craftwork, same era, and Marcus..." David's voice held an edge of excitement and concern. "There's something inside, a confession, a woman's handwriting. It mentions murder, poison, and a date that corresponds to an unsolved death from 1885. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of history pressing down on him. How many lockets had been hidden? How many women's voices had been silenced? How many secrets did Victorian gold conceal? "Send me photographs," Marcus said. "And David, be careful. The last time we opened one of these, we drew the attention of people who'd kill to keep the truth buried." "I remember," David said. "But Marcus, whoever hid this locket wanted it found. Just like Margaret. These women, they found ways to leave evidence even when they were trapped. That's worth investigating, don't you think?" Marcus looked out the Edinburgh window at the city's historic streets, all those buildings containing all those stories. He thought of his father, investigating alone until he was silenced. He thought of Margaret Wilson, poisoned by her husband's family to cover a murder. He thought of Eleanor Hayes, spending 40 years preserving evidence and waiting for the right person to act. "Yes," Marcus said quietly. "It's worth investigating." That evening, Marcus sat in his hotel room reviewing David's photographs of the new locket. The mechanism was different, more sophisticated, suggesting a later date, perhaps 1890s rather than 1880s. But the principle was identical: a hiding place for truth in a time when women had almost no power to speak it openly. He pulled up the museum's website displaying the Margaret Wilson exhibition. Over 50,000 people had visited since it opened. Educational programs had been developed based on Margaret's story. Universities were incorporating the case into courses on Victorian crime, gender studies, and historical investigation. The exhibition had won multiple awards for historical interpretation, but more importantly, it had inspired others to look at historical cases with new eyes. Dozens of researchers had contacted Marcus about unsolved mysteries they'd discovered in their own investigations. The dormant cases of silenced women had begun to speak. Marcus returned to London to meet with David and examine the new locket in person. They decided to follow the same protocols that had worked with Margaret's case: careful documentation, professional conservation, historical context research. The new confession revealed another woman's story. Eleanor Ashby, who'd poisoned her abusive husband in 1885 and had been imprisoned for 20 years after her guilt was discovered. When she was finally released in 1905, having served her sentence, she'd created a locket with her confession, knowing that someday historians would understand the desperation that had driven her. Eleanor Ashby's case opened up more questions. How many women had been imprisoned for fighting back against their abusers? How many confessions existed in hidden places waiting to be discovered? How many silenced voices could still teach us about injustice, courage, and the limitations of historical law? 2 years later, a second exhibition opened at the V&A Museum. Silent Witnesses, Women's Hidden Testimonies. It featured the new locket, Eleanor Ashby's confession, and 3 others that had been discovered through Marcus's work with the NCA. Each told a story of a woman whose voice had been stolen, who had found ingenious ways to preserve truth, who had waited for the world to finally listen. The opening reception drew politicians, historians, crime victims' advocates, and journalists. A documentary was being filmed about Marcus's investigation work. Universities were creating internship programs to train young historians in investigating cold cases. Richard Webb's legacy, and Marcus's mission to complete it, had created something larger than one case. It had opened pathways for countless silenced voices to finally be heard. On the 5th anniversary of his father's death, Marcus stood at his grave in Highgate Cemetery. He placed flowers on the headstone and spoke quietly to the stone. "I know why you were investigating, Dad. Not just for justice, but because you believed truth mattered, that it was worth dying for." Marcus felt tears on his cheeks. "I'm making sure that belief means something. Every case I reopen, every woman's confession I find, every injustice I help expose. It's because you showed me that the truth doesn't stop mattering just because people die. It waits. And eventually someone finds it." He stood in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of his father's sacrifice, of Margaret Wilson's murder, of Eleanor Hayes's 40-year vigil, of Dr. Whitmore's patient documentation. So much suffering, so much injustice. But all of it leading to this: a world where hidden truths could finally be revealed, where women's silenced voices could be heard across centuries. David Chen joined him, standing respectfully at a distance. When Marcus was ready, David placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ready?" David asked. "No," Marcus admitted. "But I'm going anyway. There's another locket, this one from 1892. Eleanor Ashby's sister apparently hid a confession about witnessing Eleanor's abuse. Historians in Devon just found it in an estate archive." David smiled. "Of course there is. The truth keeps calling, doesn't it?" "Yes," Marcus said. "It does, and I'm done ignoring it." As they walked away from the cemetery, Marcus looked back one last time at his father's grave. Somewhere in the Victorian world that had died with Margaret Wilson and Dr. Whitmore, truths were still waiting to be discovered. Confessions hidden in gold, evidence preserved by the desperate and the brave, voices crying out across centuries for someone to finally listen. Marcus Webb had found his life's work, not as an antiques dealer managing the past, but as a historian demanding accountability for it. His father's investigation hadn't ended with Simon Chen's conviction. In many ways, it had just begun. The lockets kept appearing. The confessions kept emerging. The silenced voices kept speaking. And Marcus kept listening. Because that's what happened when you finally decided to hear what people had been trying to tell you for 136 years. The truth, once unleashed, could never be buried again. The end